He had been riding before he could read, not exaggerating. Not the kind of thing people say about a skill they came to early, and came to easily and now describe in the terms that make the coming to sound mythological. Literally, Ezekiel James Monroe had been on the back of a horse at age 4 in the corral at the back of his grandfather's property in Blackwood County, Texas, holding the saddle horn with both hands, while his grandfather led the mare in slow circles on a lead rope, and the mare's name had been Clementine. And she had been the most patient animal Ezekiel had ever been associated with in 63 years of being associated with animals, and the 4-year-old on her back had not been afraid. He had understood something in those first circles in the corral that he would spend the next 5 decades working to articulate in a way that other people could understand, that the horse and the rider are not two things. That what happens on a horse is a relationship between two organisms, one of which is larger and stronger and faster and more instinctual than the other. And the relationship functions when both parties are paying attention. Not the performance of attention, not the appearance of control, but genuine reciprocal attention. The kind that produces trust in both directions, and that cannot be faked by either party. Because horses, unlike most of the entities a person interacts with over the course of a life, are impossible to deceive. You cannot convince a horse you are confident when you are not. You cannot convince a horse you are present when your mind is somewhere else. The horse knows. The horse has always known. Ezekiel Monroe had learned this at 4 years old, and had never stopped learning it. And 63 years later it was the thing he began with when he talked about what riding was, which was something he was called on to do with some regularity, because he was the president of the Black Cowboys Association of America, and had been for 6 years. And because the Black Cowboys Association had built over the preceding 2 decades a public presence that brought Ezekiel to schools and community centers and county fairs and rodeos with the specific mission of making visible something that American popular culture had spent a century rendering invisible, the black cowboy who had existed since the cattle drives and who had been present in the founding culture of Western riding, and who had been systematically erased from the representation of that culture until organizations like the one Ezekiel ran decided that the erasure was no longer going to stand uncontested. He was not a gentle man about this. He was not an angry man about it either. He was a precise man about it, which was the quality that the work required. The precision to say exactly what had happened to the historical record, and exactly what was being done to correct it without the excess of sentiment that made the audience feel they had been lectured to rather than shown something they had not previously seen. He had learned that precision from his grandfather. James Henry Monroe had been born in 1919 in Blackwood County, Texas, to parents who owned 12 acres and 2 horses, and who had taught their children in the way that black families in rural Texas in the early 20th century taught their children things that were not taught anywhere else, through the work itself, through the life itself, through the daily practice of doing what needed to be done on land that belonged to them and that they intended to keep. James Henry had grown up on those 12 acres and had worked them and had watched his father work them and had learned from the watching and the working what it meant to have a relationship with land and with animals that was not abstract but immediate, daily reciprocal. You took care of the land and the animals, and they took care of you, and the relationship required your full attention every day without exception. James Henry Monroe had eventually grown the 12 acres to 47. He had bought a second horse, then a third. Then in 1952, the property next to his became available when its owner, a white farmer named Ridley, who had been farming it badly for 20 years, finally gave up and moved to Dallas and James. Henry Monroe had bought the property at a price that required borrowing from 2 sources and that he had paid back in 4 years through a combination of cattle income and the horse training operation he had started, which was something he had discovered he was specifically good at taking a young horse and developing it into a working animal, through the kind of patient, attentive, consistent work that the relationship required. He had built Monroe Ranch, not the land. The land had belonged to his family for 3 generations, growing from the original 12 acres James Henry Monroe had farmed to the 47 that Ezekiel's father Charles Monroe had inherited and expanded and worked for 24 years before Ezekiel had inherited it in 2002. What Ezekiel had built was what the ranch had become in the years since, not just a cattle operation and a horse training facility, but a place with a specific purpose beyond its economic function. He had started the Black Cowboys Association of America 12 years ago, not from nothing. There had been organizations doing related work, regional groups, historical societies, exhibition groups that documented the history of black cowboys in the American West. But there had not been an organization that combined the historical documentation with an active youth program, a competitive training component, and the specific public-facing mission of making visible in real time, in competitive arenas and public exhibitions, the continuing presence of black cowboy culture in American life. Ezekiel had started it the way he did most things, by identifying exactly what needed to be done and then doing it. He had recruited 12 founding members from across Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, men and women who had been riding and roping and competing for years, and who had been doing it, each of them in the specific isolation of someone who is good at something that the culture around them insists is not theirs. He had organized the first meeting at Monroe Ranch in the barn on a Saturday evening in October 12 years ago, with folding chairs and coffee and 2 horses looking over the stall doors, with the incurious attention of horses who have seen many meetings of many kinds and who have their own opinions about the efficiency of human decision-making. He had said at that first meeting, "We are not here to be resentful. We are here because the history has been erased and we have the standing to restore it. And we are going to restore it by being present in every arena where this culture lives, and by being present correctly with excellence, with professionalism, with the full weight of everything we know how to do. We are going to be so visibly, undeniably good that the absence becomes impossible to maintain." 11 of the 12 founding members had stayed. 12 years later, the Black Cowboys Association had 43 member organizations across 16 states, an annual gathering at Monroe Ranch each June that drew 230 participants, a youth program that had trained over 400 students, and a 5-year relationship with the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum that had produced the first permanent exhibition of black cowboy history in any major museum in the country. It was 114 acres now, which was what it had been when Ezekiel's father had inherited it in 1978, and what it had been when Ezekiel had inherited it in 2002, when his father died at 71. Ezekiel had not added acreage. He had had several opportunities to add acreage in the past 20 years, when neighboring properties had been available and when the offer prices had been within range, and each time he had declined. Not because he could not afford it, but because he had thought carefully about what he wanted Monroe Ranch to be, and had decided that 114 acres was the right size for what the ranch actually was: a working cattle operation, a horse training facility, a location for the Black Cowboys Association's youth riding program, and a place that had been in his family for 70 years, and that represented something he did not have adequate words for, but that he understood completely, which was, we were here. We built this. We are still here. He had grown up on this land the same way his grandfather had grown up on a smaller version of it, learning through the daily practice of what the land and the animals required. He had started riding at 4. He had started roping at 7. He had been entered in his first junior rodeo at 9 years old, a fact that his grandfather had been more excited about than his parents, who had approached it with the specific combination of pride and anxiety that black parents in Blackwood County, Texas in 1971 brought to their children's participation in an overwhelmingly white competitive institution. His grandfather had said, "You go ride. You ride the way I showed you, and you ride like you have been riding this land your whole life, because you have been riding this land your whole life, and no arena is going to change that." He had gone. He had come in second in the junior calf roping, which was not first, but was well ahead of the median, and he had come home with a ribbon and the particular settled quality of a child who has done something difficult in a strange environment and has discovered that the difficulty is manageable, and the strangeness is temporary, and the skill is the skill regardless of the environment. He had gone back the following year. Ezekiel Monroe had competed in rodeo for 35 years, not casually, not as a pastime, as a discipline. He had competed in calf roping and team roping and saddle bronc, which is not a discipline that receives a lot of attention in conversations about rodeo, but that is among the people who know rodeo understood as one of the most demanding events. The specific combination of athleticism, horsemanship, and timing that a saddle bronc ride requires is not achievable through general athletic ability alone, but through years of specific practice in the specific environment of a bucking horse, and the years Ezekiel Monroe had put into it had produced results that the record documented 23 first-place finishes in sanctioned events, 11 regional titles, 3 national appearances at the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association's highest level of competition. Those 3 national appearances had each required a story. The first in 1987 had been his entry into the PRCA's open circuit, the highest sanctioned level which required points accumulated over a competitive season that Ezekiel had pursued with the focus of someone who has decided that a specific thing is going to happen and who has organized his life around making it happen. He had been 26 years old, working the ranch, training horses for hire, competing on weekends, accumulating points through the specific grind of the rodeo circuit that anyone who has done it describes the same way: long drives, small pay, irregular sleep. The constant management of horses in transit and the requirement that you perform the same discipline at the same level of excellence in the 11th rodeo of a season as you had in the first. Because the judges are watching the same thing regardless of how many hours you drove to get there. He had qualified. He had shown up at the national event in a truck that needed new brakes, and with a horse that needed a farrier visit he could not afford until after the event, and with his grandfather in the passenger seat who had said at the gate to the arena, "This is what we came for." And Ezekiel had said, "Yes, it is." And he had ridden. He had placed seventh in a national event at 26 years old on a horse that needed a farrier visit coming from Blackwood County, Texas, with a grandfather who had taught him to ride before he could read. 7th was not first. 7th was the record of someone who belonged in the competition and who would be back. He had been back twice. The 3rd national appearance had been his best performance, a 4th-place finish that had been at that level in that discipline in that year, a result that the people who followed saddle bronc competition had noticed, and that had in the years since become part of the historical record that the Black Cowboys Association cited when it made its case for the depth and the range and the excellence of black cowboy culture in American rodeo. He had never said it was easy. He had never said the competitive environment was without the specific frictions that competitive environments produce when a black man is competing in an overwhelmingly white arena in Texas in the 1980s. He had dealt with judges who scored him differently than they scored riders who were not black, which was something he could not prove, but could observe across multiple events and multiple scoring patterns. He had dealt with competitors who did not acknowledge him in the warm-up ring, which was a minor thing, and not the thing he chose to focus on, but which he noted. He had dealt with the specific fatigue of being the only person in a particular category at every event he attended, which is a fatigue that people who have never experienced it tend to underestimate. He had also never said those frictions had stopped him. He had said in an interview that had been printed in a magazine that covered Western riding 7 years ago, "The friction was real, and I rode through it." Both of those things are true at the same time. I am not interested in describing the friction for its own sake. I am interested in the riding. The riding is the record. The riding is the argument. The riding is what my grandfather said you go ride. Midnight Justice was a 16-hand black quarter horse 7 years old, bred on Monroe Ranch from a mare Ezekiel had trained himself and a stallion he had acquired specifically for the quality of temperament he wanted to breed into the next generation of ranch horses. Midnight Justice was not a rodeo horse in the competitive sense. He was a ranch horse trained for the specific work of a working cattle operation. Responsive, quick-footed, calm under pressure, capable of the precise lateral movements that cattle work required, and that required a horse with both the physical capacity and the trained understanding of what it was being asked to do. He was a beautiful horse, which Ezekiel acknowledged without sentimentality, but also without false modesty. The horse was beautiful the way some things are simply objectively beautiful, and the beauty was connected to the functionality. Because a horse that moves the way Midnight Justice moved was moving that way because the structure and the training and the relationship between horse and rider had produced a specific quality of motion that was both efficient and, to someone who understood what they were looking at, genuinely pleasing. Ezekiel had ridden him into the arena at the Blackwood County Rodeo and Stock Show at 11:43 in the morning on the first Saturday of August. He had not intended to enter the arena at that precise moment. The morning had begun at 4:45, which was the time Ezekiel's mornings began when he had a horse being trailered for an event. He had gone through the preparation routine that 35 years of rodeo had made automatic: feeding, checking the horse's feet and legs, checking the trailer's floor, and the hitching hardware, loading Midnight Justice with the practiced calm of a man who has loaded horses into trailers thousands of times, and who knows that the horse's willingness to load is directly connected to the quality of attention the handler brings to the process. Midnight Justice had loaded without resistance, which was what he always did when Ezekiel was the one asking. He had driven to the Blackwood County Fairgrounds in the dark with the trailer attached the road familiar from 35 years of the same drive, and had arrived at 5:15, which was 2 hours before the gates opened for exhibitors, and 3 hours before the gates opened for the public, because arriving early was a practice he had never abandoned, because arriving early was the difference between having time to observe what was happening in the environment you were about to operate in, and arriving without that time and being required to operate without the information that the observation would have provided. He had unloaded Midnight Justice in the trailer parking area, and had moved him to the exhibitor holding area, which was a temporary set of tie rails at the south end of the fairgrounds, and had begun the grooming routine that the demonstration required. Not the daily grooming of a working ranch horse, but the specific preparation of a horse for a public exhibition, which included a level of attention to coat and mane and tail that a working day did not require, but that an exhibition in front of 600 people in a grandstand merited. He had met the 8 students at 7:30. They came in on 2 separate vehicles, accompanied by 3 parents who served as the association's volunteer chaperones for event days. The students ranged from 11 to 16, and they ranged in riding ability from Mia Torres, the 11-year-old who had been with the program for 2 years, and who had the specific unconscious ease on a horse that develops when you start young enough for the balance to become body memory rather than conscious effort, to Jordan Wheeler, 14, who had been with the program for 2 summers, and who had the focused attentiveness of someone in the middle stage of learning something past the stage of figuring out the basics. Not yet at the stage of mastery, in the stage where the work is hardest and most interesting. He had done the morning briefing at 8 in the shade of a tent the association kept for exactly this purpose, with the students in a line facing him and the horses tied behind him and the fairgrounds coming to life around them. He had said, "Today we are going to ride in front of 600 people. You have trained for 6 weeks for exactly this. The training was for exactly this moment. The moment is now. What do I need from you?" Jordan Wheeler had said, back straight, weight in the heels, eyes forward. Ezekiel had said, that is correct. He had said it the way he said everything he said to his students, with the full weight of meaning it. Because when you tell a young person that what they have said is correct, the weight you put behind it is the weight they carry with them into the arena, and the arena requires weight. He had been approaching the arena from the south on horseback, having ridden Midnight Justice from the trailer parking area where the horse had been loaded that morning across the back lot of the fairgrounds in the direction of the warm-up ring where the association's youth riders were being staged. The youth riders were 8 students from the association's summer riding program, ranging in age from 11 to 16, who were to perform a group demonstration ride as part of the rodeo's midday exhibition. a 15-minute demonstration that Ezekiel had organized, and that he and 2 other association instructors had been preparing the students for over 6 weeks. The demonstration was the Black Cowboys Association's most public annual event in Blackwood County, and had been part of the Rodeo's program for 9 years, since the year that Ezekiel and then rodeo director Thomas Avery had negotiated its inclusion as a standing feature of the midday exhibition. The negotiation had taken 4 conversations over 2 years. Thomas Avery had not been resistant. He had been uncertain about whether the program would work, whether the execution would meet the rodeo's standard, whether the audience would respond. Ezekiel had said at the second conversation, "Thomas, I have been riding in this county for 35 years. The only question you need to ask is whether we can ride. We can ride. Let us show you." Avery had said 1 year exhibition only. Ezekiel had said 1 year. 9 years later, it was a standing feature of the midday program. He had been riding toward the warm-up ring when Officer Dale Pruitt had stepped into the path. Dale Pruitt was 34 years old. He had been with the Blackwood County Sheriff's Department for 6 years, the past 8 months of which had been in the Event Security Unit, which provided law enforcement presence at county fairgrounds events including the annual rodeo and stock show. He was not the senior officer on the rodeo detail. That was Sergeant Karen Webb, 41, who had been managing event security for the county for 4 years, and who had been briefed on the rodeo layout, including the specific routing that exhibitors and demonstrators would use to enter and exit the arena areas, which included the south corridor that Ezekiel Monroe was using. Pruitt had not been present at the briefing on that corridor. He had been assigned to the south perimeter at 6 a.m. and had been there for 5.5 hours, managing the flow of vehicles and foot traffic at the south gate, which was a specific and bounded assignment that had not included information about the exhibition. Demonstrators who would be using the south corridor at midday, because the briefing that had included that information had occurred at 7 a.m. in a location Pruitt had not been. He had seen a man on a horse approaching from the south lot. The man was black. He was wearing working ranch clothes, a dark shirt, jeans, boots, and a gray felt hat that had the specific worn quality of a hat that has been on a man's head in working conditions for long enough to have taken on the shape of the work. He was riding a large black horse at a walk with the relaxed, upright posture of someone who has been in the saddle for a significant portion of their life. He had no badge indicating event staff or exhibitor clearance visible to Pruitt from his position at the moment of first observation. Pruitt had not asked himself what the most likely explanation for this specific person's presence in this specific location was. He had not run through the logical sequence. This is the south corridor, which leads to the warm-up ring, which is where exhibition demonstrators stage before the midday program. He had not thought man on horseback approaching the arena in the late morning is probably an exhibitor or a demonstrator. He had not noted the saddle, the quality of the horse, the ease of the rider, any of the specific visual information that 35 years of rodeo experience had placed in that image that would have been legible to anyone who knew how to read it. He had seen black man on horse, no badge visible. The south corridor had been his assigned area for 5.5 hours, and no one had told him that black men on horses would be coming through it at midday. This was the specific geometry of the assumption, not a decision made consciously, but a conclusion reached by the gap between what he saw and what he expected to see, and the resolution of that gap in the direction of suspicion, rather than in the direction of the most plausible explanation. The most plausible explanation for a man on horseback moving through the exhibitor corridor at midday at a rodeo was that the man was an exhibitor. The most plausible explanation for the quality of horsemanship visible in the way the man was sitting the horse was that the man was an experienced rider. The most plausible explanation for the gray felt hat and the working clothes and the ease of the posture was that this was a man who had been riding for a very long time and who was going somewhere specific. All of that was available to Pruitt. He did not reach for it. He reached instead for the space where the exhibitor badge should have been visible and was not yet visible, and he weighted that absence above all of the presence that surrounded it: the horse, the rider, the tack, the posture, the corridor that led to the warm-up ring, the midday exhibition that was 45 minutes away. He weighted the absence of the immediately visible badge above everything else, and then he stepped into the path. What was missing from Pruitt's assessment was not information. The information was in front of him. What was missing was the assumption that the man on the horse had a legitimate reason to be there. The charitable assumption, the one that would have led him to ask, rather than stop. "Can I see your exhibitor badge?" rather than "You can't bring a horse through this corridor." The first question is a verification. The second is a declaration. The first assumes authorization until absence is confirmed. The second assumes unauthorized presence and demands the person prove otherwise. Pruitt had stepped into the path. He had said, "Sir, you need to stop. You can't bring a horse through this corridor." Ezekiel Monroe brought midnight justice to a halt. He did it with a shift of his weight rather than a visible rein action, which was the quality of communication between a rider and a well-trained horse that made the transition from motion to stillness look effortless, because it was not an interruption of the horse's movement, but a continuation of the ongoing conversation between rider and horse that produced whatever the situation required. He said, "I'm with the Black Cowboys Association. We have a demonstration in the midday exhibition. I'm going to the warm-up ring." Pruitt said, "I'm going to need to see some credentials, sir." Ezekiel said, "My name is Ezekiel Monroe. I'm the president of the Black Cowboys Association of America. My group has been part of this Rodeo's program for 9 years. I need to get to the warm-up ring. My students are waiting." Pruitt said, "Sir, I still need to see credentials." Ezekiel looked at him. He was a man who had spent 35 years competing in environments where his presence had required explanation and his credentials had required additional verification in ways that his white competitors' credentials had not required. And he had developed across those 35 years the specific patience of someone who has learned to stay in the correct lane, while the unnecessary obstacle resolves itself because leaving the correct lane produces worse outcomes than holding it. He said, "I have a badge in my vest pocket. I'm going to reach for it now." He reached slowly and deliberately into his vest pocket and produced the event exhibitor badge, a laminated card attached to a lanyard issued by the Rodeo Administration Office, confirming his identity and his role, and his authorization to access the exhibition areas. He held it out toward Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the badge. He said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to dismount." Ezekiel said, "I beg your pardon?" Pruitt said, "I need you to bring the horse to a halt and dismount. We can verify your credentials on the ground." Ezekiel said, "My credentials are in your hand." Pruitt said, "Sir, I need you to dismount now." He had his hand on the side of Midnight Justice's bridle. He had put his hand on the bridle of Ezekiel Monroe's horse. There are things that people who ride understand about a horse that people who do not ride have to be told. One of them is this: a horse that is calm and responsive with its rider is calm because of the relationship between horse and rider, which is a relationship built over time through consistent, attentive interaction that has produced mutual trust. That trust is specific to the relationship and does not automatically extend to a stranger who approaches the horse with the specific energy of someone who is not paying attention to the horse but is paying attention to the rider, and who grabs the bridle in a way that communicates neither respect for the horse's space nor understanding of what the bridle represents in the communication between horse and rider. Midnight Justice was a trained horse. He was not an anxious horse. He was not a horse that spooked at small disturbances. He did not like the hand on his bridle. He expressed this the way horses express things that they do not like, with a subtle but immediate shift of his weight, a tightening of his neck, a movement of his head. It was a minimal response. It was a horse communicating. To someone who understood horses, it was a clear and legible communication. To someone who did not understand horses, it was a large animal beginning to move in a way that required interpretation. Ezekiel Monroe was watching the horse. He was reading the horse's response the way he read it every day, completely in real time, with the full attention of someone who has spent 63 years developing the capacity to understand what an animal is telling him. He was also managing his own response, which required a different but related set of skills, the specific capacity to stay in the correct quality of presence when the situation is producing pressure that wants to shift you into a different quality of presence. He was 63 years old. He had been in situations like this, not identical but structurally similar, more times than he intended to count. The mechanism was always the same. Someone saw him in a place he had every right to be and could not quite integrate the seeing with the assumption, and the gap between the seeing and the assumption produced an action that had no legitimate basis. The action varied. The mechanism was consistent. He had learned across 63 years what worked and what did not work in the moments that the mechanism produced. What worked staying still, stating the facts, not providing more information than was asked for, not providing less information than the situation required, keeping the horse calm by keeping himself calm because the horse would feel what he felt and reflect it back into the environment, and the environment did not need any additional tension. He thought about his students in the warm-up ring. He thought about Jordan Wheeler saying back straight, weight in the heels, eyes forward. He thought that is the correct instruction. That is what this moment requires. Back straight, weight in the heels, eyes forward, he said to Pruitt with the specific controlled precision of someone who is managing two situations simultaneously. I need you to take your hand off the bridle, please. He said please the way you say something when you mean it specifically and not generally. Not as a politeness marker, but as a real request addressed to a real person that the real person had the capacity to either honor or not honor, and that he was asking them to honor, because the alternative was a horse in an unexpected situation, which was the only part of what was happening that had any genuine urgency. Pruitt said, "Sir, I need you to dismount." He had increased the pressure on the bridle. The arena was 40 feet to the east. The warm-up ring was 80 feet to the south. The south grandstand of the Blackwood County Rodeo was to the west with approximately 600 spectators in the seats for the midday session. The grandstand faced the arena, which meant the south grandstand sightlines included the corridor where Ezekiel Monroe was being asked to dismount from Midnight Justice. The August morning was in its late warmth, not the peak heat of afternoon, but the building heat of late morning in Texas, the specific temperature of a day that is on its way to something hotter with the fairground smell of animal and fried food and dust. The rodeo announcer was Marcus Tate, 47, a man who had been announcing rodeos in Blackwood County for 19 years and who had the specific, deeply professional voice of a rodeo announcer, authoritative, warm, effortlessly audible, capable of filling a grandstand without strain. He had been narrating the interim material between events when he had looked to his left toward the south corridor and had seen what was happening. He had the PA microphone in his hand. He had not put it down. He had said into the PA folks, "It looks like we've got a situation in the south corridor. That's Ezekiel Monroe on Midnight Justice Zeke. Monroe, some of you know him, president of the Black Cowboys Association, 9 years participating in this rodeo's program, and he appears to be being detained by a security officer." The grandstand had turned. Marcus Tate's announcement had taken 11 seconds to deliver. By the time he finished speaking, approximately 400 of the 600 spectators in the south grandstand had shifted their attention from the arena to the south corridor where the man on the black horse and the security officer were visible in the open space between the arena fence and the exhibitor tents. What they saw, a man on horseback, straight-backed, sitting on a 16-hand black horse with the quality of ease that belongs to someone who has been in that specific position for a very long time. The gray felt hat, the dark shirt, the posture of a man who was not going anywhere and was not agitated about the fact that he was not going anywhere, who was simply present in the way that Midnight Justice was simply present, calm, attentive waiting. And an officer with his hand on the bridle of the horse. 600 people had turned to look at the south corridor. Some of them knew Ezekiel Monroe. They knew him from the association's demonstrations, from the rodeo, from Blackwood County's general community, from the specific knowledge that accumulates in a county where people have lived their whole lives about the people who have lived their whole lives there. They knew Monroe Ranch. They knew the Black Cowboys Association. They knew the 9 years of the demonstration program, and what it represented, and who had built it, and what it had taken to build it. For those 600 people, the image in the South Corridor was not an abstraction. It was a specific person in a specific situation, and the specific situation was wrong. Some of them did not know him. They had come to the rodeo for the rodeo, and what they saw in the South Corridor was a man on horseback being told to get off his horse by a security officer. And they did not need any additional information to understand what was wrong with that, because they had grown up with horses, and they understood what it meant to ask a rider to dismount in the middle of a transit, and they understood that whatever the officer was doing, the man on the horse had not done anything to justify it. Ezekiel Monroe was on midnight justice, straight-backed hands on the reins, the gray felt hat, the dark shirt, the specific posture of a man who has been in this situation before. Not this specific situation, but the general situation of being required to explain himself in an environment that should not require the explanation, and who has made the decision to maintain exactly the quality of bearing he brings to everything, because his bearing is the argument, and the argument has never once not been correct. He was managing midnight justice with the specific minimal communication of a rider who is keeping a horse calm in a situation that is producing pressure on both of them, and the communication between horse and rider was not visible to most of the 600 people watching, but was legible to the ones who knew what to look for, the slight adjustments of seat and hand. The still quality of the rider that told the horse, "I am here. I am calm. We are going to be all right." Pruitt was holding the bridle. A woman in the third row of the South Grandstand stood up. She shouted Zeke. Her name was Harriet Coleman. She was 61 years old and had been coming to the Blackwood County Rodeo every year for 30 years, and she had watched Ezekiel Monroe ride for most of those 30 years. And she had brought her 3 kids to the Black Cowboys Association program when they were young, and the oldest of those 3 kids, now 30, still rode specifically because of that program. She stood up and shouted his name because the situation was wrong, and because she was the kind of person who said what she thought when the situation was wrong, and the word that came out was his name. Someone beside her stood up, someone behind him. The name moved through the grandstand the way names move through crowds that know a person, not as a signal, not as an organized chant, but as the natural, uncontrolled sound of recognition. 2 syllables repeated by different mouths at different moments, gaining volume as more mouths joined it, building from the specific knowledge of specific people into the broader response of a crowd that has converged on the same understanding. Zeke, Zeke, Zeke! Then it changed. It changed the way crowd responses to injustice change when the crowd has enough information and enough investment, not as a planned transition, but as an organic shift from recognition to demand. The specific name was the recognition. The 3 words were the demand, and they arrived not from the section of the grandstand that knew him. They arrived from everywhere, from the people who knew him and the people who did not, from the people who understood the history, and the people who understood only the moment, all of them arriving at the same 3 words through different routes and saying them with the same voice. Let him ride, let him ride, let him ride. 600 people, the August morning, the Texas heat. 600 people in a grandstand at the Blackwood County Rodeo saying what they were saying without being told to say it, without anyone organizing it, without a microphone or a leader or a plan. Saying it because it was true, and because the truth was visible, and because 600 people had turned and looked at the South Corridor and had arrived independently at the same conclusion, and the conclusion was, let him ride. Marcus Tate at the announcer's stand had his hand over his mouth. He had been announcing rodeos for 19 years. He had never had his hand over his mouth at the announcer's stand. Sergeant Karen Webb heard the crowd through her radio at 20 seconds into the chant. She was at the North Gate. She said into the radio, all units, what's happening at the South Corridor. She did not get a clear answer in the next 5 seconds, so she moved. She was a 41-year-old woman who had been doing event security for 4 years and who had run track in college and who maintained the specific physical readiness that the work required, because events go wrong in the way that they always go wrong. Not slowly, not with warning, but all at once. And in the moments when they go wrong, the people responsible for managing them need to move. She moved from the north gate at a run. The north gate to the south corridor was approximately 140 meters through the exhibitor staging area, past the livestock pens, through the gap in the arena fence that led to the corridor. She ran it with her radio in her hand and her eyes forward, and the specific targeted awareness of someone who is moving toward a situation she does not yet fully understand, and is trying to understand by moving toward it as fast as possible. She had heard the chant before she arrived. She had heard it at the north gate, 600 people saying, "Let him ride." She had understood in the first 5 seconds of running what had produced it, not in its specifics but in its general shape. Someone had done something to someone in the south corridor. The grandstand had seen it, and the grandstand had produced the specific, organized response that crowds produce when they have collectively assessed a situation and arrived at a verdict. She did not know who was in the south corridor. She knew from the radio that the crowd was responding to something involving a security officer and a man on horseback. She had 12 years of institutional knowledge about what that combination of elements meant when it produced a crowd response of this magnitude, and the institutional knowledge told her to run faster. She was at the south corridor in 90 seconds. She saw Ezekiel Monroe on Midnight Justice. She saw Pruitt with his hand on the bridle. She saw the grandstand. She heard the chant still going still, building 600 people in the August heat of a Texas morning saying, "Let him ride." She said to Pruitt, "Step back from the horse." "Right now." He said, "Sergeant, I was verifying." She said, "Step back from the horse." He stepped back. She looked at Ezekiel Monroe. She said, "Mr. Monroe, I apologize for this. You are cleared to proceed to the warm-up ring." He looked at her for a moment. He looked at the grandstand. He looked at the 600 people who were still on their feet, still saying what they were saying. He gave a single nod, not to Webb, not as a response to the apology, but to the grandstand. He put his heels to Midnight Justice. They went. Midnight Justice moved from still to moving in the specific way of a horse that has been waiting to move for a long time and has now been given permission, and the motion was the motion of a 16-hand black quarter horse at an easy lope. And the easy lope was the motion of a horse that has been trained for 30 years by a man who learned from his grandfather what a relationship with an animal actually required, and the relationship between Ezekiel Monroe and Midnight Justice was visible in the motion, the way that 30 years of a relationship is always visible in the things the people in it do together. He loped through the south corridor toward the warm-up ring. He did not look at the grandstand as he went. He was riding. When he was riding, he was fully riding, not riding and performing awareness of an audience, not riding and managing his presentation for 600 people who were watching. He was riding the way his grandfather had taught him to ride, which was completely with full attention to the horse and to the next 20 feet of ground, and to the way Midnight Justice was moving beneath him. The horse was at his best, the easy lope of a horse that has been waiting to move, and has now been given room to move, and is moving through it with the full quality of a horse that understands what movement is supposed to feel like. The chant followed him. 600 people watching a man on a black horse move through the August morning of a Texas fairgrounds at an easy lope is not the same as watching him stand still. Standing still is presence. Moving is presence in time, the specific unfolding quality of a thing that you have to watch, because if you look away, you will miss it, and you do not want to miss it. Ezekiel Monroe and Midnight Justice moving through the south corridor in the aftermath of 600 people telling them to go, had the quality of something that had resolved, and resolved things have a particular beauty that things in tension do not have the beauty of a note that has been struck and is sustaining. 600 people were on their feet watching it sustain. The grandstand was on its feet. Marcus Tate had his microphone back. He said into the PA with the full professional warmth of 19 years at the announcer's stand, "Ladies and gentlemen, that is Ezekiel Monroe and Midnight Justice, and they are going to the warm-up ring, and the midday exhibition is going to happen on schedule. And I have been announcing this rodeo for 19 years, and I have never been more proud of this crowd." The crowd's response was not something that translates well into description. It was the specific sound of 600 people in a grandstand at a Texas rodeo in August, releasing something they had been holding for the past 2 minutes, which is not the same sound as applause, and is not the same sound as shouting, and is something that includes both, and that has the quality of something that has resolved rather than something that has simply ended. Ezekiel Monroe did not look back. He reached the warm-up ring at 11:51. His 8 students were there, mounted and ready, and one of them, a 14-year-old named Jordan Wheeler, who was in his second summer with the association's program and who had the specific alert attentiveness of a kid who has been learning something for long enough to start understanding what he does not yet know, said Mr. Monroe. "We heard. We heard everything." Ezekiel said, "Mount up correctly. Back straight. Weight in the heels. Eyes forward." Jordan said, "Yes, sir." They mounted correctly. The demonstration began at noon. Marcus Tate introduced it on the PA with the full weight of 19 years of professional warmth and the specific additional weight of a man who had witnessed something that morning that he intended the grandstand to hold in mind when they watched what was coming. Ladies and gentlemen, for the 9th consecutive year, the Blackwood County Rodeo and Stock Show is proud to present the midday exhibition of the Black Cowboys Association of America. These are 8 riders who have been training for 6 weeks under the direction of Association President Ezekiel Monroe. What you are about to see is the product of that training and of a tradition that goes back to the beginning of what the American West actually was. Please give them the full attention they have earned. The gate opened. Ezekiel Monroe came through first on Midnight Justice. He came through at a collected trot, not the easy lope of the corridor, but the specific elevated trot of a horse, performing where every footfall is intentional, and the communication between horse and rider is visible in the quality of the movement. The way the horse's back is loose and swinging, the way the rider moves with it rather than against it, the way the whole system of horse and human is functioning as a single coordinated entity. The grandstand, which had already been paying full attention, paid more. Behind him, in 2 columns of 4-8 riders in association shirts, dark blue. The association's color came through the gate on 8 horses, a gray 2 bays, a sorrel, a paint, a roan, a palomino, and the chestnut mare Delta with Jordan Wheeler in the saddle. They were arranged by experience. The 4 more senior riders at the front of the columns, the 4 newer riders at the back. The arrangement was part of the demonstration's structure because the demonstration was not just about what the riders could do individually. It was about what they could do together, and together required the specific trust that developed between riders who had spent 6 weeks working in proximity to each other's horses, learning to read each other's timing and pace the way that all group movement requires. The demonstration was 15 minutes. The first 6 minutes were group work formations and transitions, the 8 riders moving as a single unit through the arena at various gates, the horses adjusting to each other's proximity with the calm of horses that had been trained to tolerate the close presence of other horses without losing their attention to the rider. The formations had names. The association had named them during the program's first summer, and kept the names because naming things is how you keep them. And the transitions between formations were the specific test of whether the riders had internalized the timing. Internalized timing is not a thing you develop in 6 weeks. It is a thing you develop in 6 weeks enough to demonstrate the beginning of it, which is what the first-year riders were doing, and in multiple summers enough to demonstrate its full development, which is what the senior riders were doing. And watching both simultaneously is how a grandstand understands what a 6-week program actually requires and what it actually produces. The grandstand understood. The next 5 minutes were individual work. Each rider took a turn at the center of the arena with the specific pattern that matched their training level. The newer riders demonstrating control and basic movement. The senior riders demonstrating the more complex work of horses and riders who have been together long enough to develop the specific shorthand that advanced training produces. Jordan Wheeler was second to last in the individual rotation. He took Delta to the center of the arena and worked the pattern that Ezekiel had designed specifically for a rider at Jordan's level, something that showed what Jordan could do without requiring what Jordan could not yet do, which is the particular skill of teaching that produces students who are not set up to fail by being asked to perform beyond their current capacity. Jordan rode the pattern with composure. He wrote it the way a 14-year-old who has been told repeatedly and with patience that the composure is more important than the event. Rides with complete attention to the horse with the specific adjustments that Delta required and that Jordan had learned to read over 6 weeks with the back straight and the weight in the heels and the eyes forward that were the first 3 things Ezekiel Monroe had ever said to him, and that were in some ways the most important 3 things a rider could know. The grandstand responded to Jordan's turn the way grandstands respond to young riders who are clearly good with the particular warmth of people who can see both what is already there and what is coming. The final 4 minutes were Ezekiel Monroe and Midnight Justice alone. Ezekiel Monroe led the demonstration. He rode Midnight Justice through the exhibition patterns with the relaxed, specific quality of a man who is doing something he has done for 63 years. And who is doing it in front of an audience that has decided to pay full attention, and the full attention of 600 people in a grandstand in August, is something that a horse feels, and that a rider feels, and that produces in both horse and rider the specific elevated quality of presence that a performance demands, and that performers either have or develop. Midnight Justice was at his best. They always were when the crowd was paying attention. He ran the exhibition patterns at the level that 35 years of professional rodeo competition and 63 years of being on horseback produce, with the specific authority that comes from doing a thing so many times that the conscious mind no longer manages it, and the body has taken it completely over. The body that does not think about what it is doing is the body that does it best. Ezekiel Monroe's body had not needed to think about riding for a long time. What it did in the arena with the crowd paying full attention, and the August sun overhead, and the chant of the morning still somewhere in the air, was ride the way riding is supposed to look like, something that is not work at all, because the work has already been done, and what remains is the expression of it. The demonstration concluded with 8 riders in a line at the center of the arena facing the grandstand. Jordan Wheeler was in that line. His back was straight. His weight was in his heels, his eyes were forward. The grandstand stood for it the way grandstands stand for things that have earned it completely without reservation in the loud, specific physical language of people who have watched something and want the person who did it to know that they saw it. Ezekiel Monroe received it from the saddle without moving. Then he turned Midnight Justice and they walked out of the arena. He went back to the exhibitor holding area with the students behind him. He dismounted, which he did with the specific economy of movement of a man who has dismounted from a horse thousands of times, and who does not think about the mechanics of it the way a person does not think about the mechanics of walking after they have been walking for 63 years. He ran up the stirrups. He ran a hand down Midnight Justice's neck. He turned to the students. 8 riders on 8 horses in their dark blue association shirts in the August afternoon of Blackwood County, Texas, just back from the arena where 600 people had stood and watched them do the thing they had trained 6 weeks to do, and the standing ovation was still somewhere in the air of the fairgrounds, in the way that things recently completed remain present in the immediate aftermath. He said you rode well. He said it the way he said things that he meant without elaboration, without enthusiasm, added for effect, without the inflation of language that makes a true thing sound like a performance of a true thing. He said you rode well, and it was true, and they knew it was true, and the knowing it was true was what mattered, not the saying of it. Jordan Wheeler said, "Thank you, Mr. Monroe." He said it the way that a 14-year-old who has been paying full attention says thank you to a teacher who has just told him something accurate about his work with the specific gravity of someone who has been trained to understand that what a teacher says about your work is a form of information and should be received as information rather than as compliment. Ezekiel said you rode that pattern clean. Jordan said, "Yes, sir, I think I did." Ezekiel said you did. "You'll ride it cleaner next summer." Jordan said, "I know." It was the correct answer. It was the answer of someone who understood that clean was not the top of the available range, that there was a range above clean that required more time and more repetition and more of the patient-specific attention that the next summer would give him, and who accepted that without resistance, because accepting that without resistance was what the work required. He started next summer at Monroe Ranch in the second week of June. He arrived at the barn at 5 in the morning, 2 hours before the first scheduled session, because the instruction had been arrive early. He had been arriving early for 2.5 summers. He was not going to stop. After the students had cooled and stowed their horses and had been picked up by the 2 parents and the association van that collected them from the fairgrounds, Ezekiel cooled midnight justice with the careful, deliberate routine of someone who understands that the work after the work is as important as the work walking the horse until his breathing had returned to resting rate, checking his legs, checking his feet, offering water at the correct interval, grooming the specific areas where the saddle and girth had created pressure. It took 40 minutes. He did it in full. He loaded Midnight Justice into the trailer at 3:40. He drove home to Monroe Ranch in the late afternoon. He unloaded the horse at 4:30, turned him out in the east pasture, stood at the pasture fence for 10 minutes, watching him move in the late afternoon light. Midnight Justice walked to the center of the pasture and dropped his head to graze. The east pasture was in its late summer fullness, the grass his grandfather had planted in 1926, 100 years of good grass under the feet of good horses. He went inside and called his daughter. Her name was Renata. She was 38 years old, a civil rights attorney in Dallas, and she had grown up on Monroe Ranch with horses and her father's specific approach to life, which was, you know what you know. You ride what you ride. You do not wait for permission from anyone to do either of those things. She had inherited the approach and deployed it in a different arena, which was the courtroom, where it worked the same way as it worked in a rodeo, completely when the person doing it had done the preparation required. She had seen the footage. She had seen it at 1:45 in the afternoon when the first video had been uploaded, because 3 people she knew had texted her with the link within 20 minutes of each other, which was the specific pattern of information travel in a community that watches out for each other. Someone sees something and immediately thinks of the people who need to know. She had watched the footage twice. She had called the ranch at 4:30 and gotten no answer because her father had been loading Midnight Justice into the trailer at 4:30, and her father was not a man who stopped the loading of a horse into a trailer to answer a phone. He called her from the ranch kitchen at 5:15. She said, "Dad." He said, "I know." She said, "Are you all right?" He said, "I am fine. I am home. Midnight Justice is in the pasture. The demonstration went well." She said, "I know the demonstration went well. 3 million people are watching the video of everything that happened before the demonstration." He said, "It'll be more than 3 million by morning." She said, "Dad." He said, "Renata." She said, "I'm calling as your attorney." He said, "You're calling as my daughter." She said, "I'm calling as both." He said, "Here is what happened." He had told her the facts in the specific order they had occurred without editorializing, without the addition of anything beyond what had actually happened. Pruitt, the credential request, the dismount demand, the bridle, Marcus Tate's voice on the PA, the chant, Webb's arrival, the stand down, the apology, the nod, the lope, the demonstration. He had told her in the way that a man who spent 35 years in competitive environments where the facts were the only thing that mattered tells a story about an incident with the facts in order. She had listened without interrupting. She said, "Do you need me to do anything?" He said, "No." He said, "What I need is for you to understand that I handled it correctly." She said, "I know you handled it correctly. I watched the video." He said, "Then you understand." She said, "I do." She said, "I also want to understand if there is a next step you want to take." He said, "I am going to be at the rodeo next year. That is the next step." She had been quiet for a moment. She said, "You sound like Granddaddy." He had said, "I know." The investigation into the incident was conducted by the Blackwood County Sheriff's Department within 48 hours of the event, triggered by the dashcam footage from a department vehicle parked near the South Corridor, the 9 separate cell phone videos uploaded to social media by grandstand attendees in the hour following the incident, and the formal complaint filed by Marcus Tate, the rodeo announcer, which had been submitted in writing to the Sheriff's Department before the rodeo's afternoon session had concluded. The investigation reviewed the footage and the credentials Ezekiel Monroe had produced. and the briefing materials from the morning's pre-deployment meeting, which established that the South Corridor had been specifically designated for exhibition demonstrators, and that Sergeant Webb had communicated this to the details officers at the 7 a.m. briefing that Pruitt had not attended. It found that Pruitt had acted outside his assigned area and without the contextual information that had been communicated in the briefing, and that his attempt to physically restrain an authorized exhibitor's horse without the authority to do so had constituted an improper use of authority. It did not use the word racist. The investigation was a procedural document. Procedural documents use procedural language. What the procedural language documented was, an officer had approached a black man on horseback at a rodeo and had, without adequate basis, demanded his credentials, demanded he dismount, and placed his hand on the horse's bridle. The procedural finding was that this had occurred outside the officer's assigned area without proper authority. The procedural finding could not capture the 63 years of experience that the officer had implicitly dismissed, or the 9 years of the Black Cowboys Association's presence at this rodeo that the officer had been unaware of, or the specific quality of the assumption that had produced the encounter. Those things were in the grandstand's response. 600 people in a Texas rodeo grandstand in August on their feet saying, "Let him ride." They had said it because they knew who he was. They had said it because some of them had watched him ride for years. Some of them had sent their kids to the Black Cowboys Association program. Some of them were from Blackwood County and knew Monroe Ranch and knew what it represented and knew what 63 years of doing this work with this kind of excellence looked like. Some of them had never seen Ezekiel Monroe before in their lives and had seen a man on a horse in a South Corridor being told to dismount, and had understood with the immediate clarity that injustice produces in people who are paying attention that what was happening was wrong. 600 different people with 600 different reasons, all of them saying the same thing. Dale Pruitt received a formal written reprimand and was required to complete the training session on event security protocols that he had missed on the morning of the rodeo. He retained his position. The Blackwood County Rodeo and Stock Show Administration issued a statement that said the Black Cowboys Association of America was a valued and essential part of the rodeo's annual program, and that the incident was under investigation. The statement used the word unfortunate. Ezekiel Monroe had read the word unfortunate and had said to his daughter, who had called from Dallas to check in after seeing the footage they used unfortunate. She had said, "I know, Dad." He had said unfortunate is the wrong word. She had said, "I know." He had said the right word is incorrect. It was incorrect, and it has been corrected, and I will be back next year. She had said, "I know you will." He had said, "and the year after." She had said, "I know." He had said, "and the year after that." She had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "Dad, I know. The world knows. Everybody who was in that grandstand knows. Everybody who watched the video knows." He had said, "I know, but I'm going to be back next year anyway, because this is my county and this is my rodeo, and I have been part of this event for 9 years, and I am going to be part of it for as many years as there is a Monroe Ranch and a Black Cowboys Association, and students who need to learn what it means to be in the saddle." She had said, "You sound like Granddaddy." He had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "I know." Jordan Wheeler had not been in the grandstand when the chant happened. He had been in the warm-up ring with the other students mounted on his horse, a chestnut mare named Delta, who was patient in the way that Clementine had been patient, which was the quality of patience that good lesson horses develop through the specific education of working with beginners. Attentive, forgiving, consistently responsive to correct signals, and not particularly responsive to incorrect ones, which is exactly the education a beginner needs. He had heard the chant from the warm-up ring. 2 syllables first, then 3. He had recognized Mr. Monroe's name in the first 2 syllables because Jordan Wheeler was 14 years old and had the specific attentiveness of a kid who had been paying close attention to the person responsible for teaching him something that was turning out to be more important to him than he had expected it to be. He had heard the name, and he had looked at the other students, and they had looked at each other, and they had heard the chant shift from the name to the demand, "Let him ride. Let him ride," and none of them had said anything. They had sat on their horses in the warm-up ring and listened. When Ezekiel Monroe had come through the gate on Midnight Justice, they had watched him approach. Ezekiel had not looked rattled. He had not looked angry. He had looked like what he was, a man who had come to do something and who was going to do it. Jordan had said, "Mr. Monroe," we heard. Ezekiel had said, "Mount up correctly, back straight, weight in the heels, eyes forward." Jordan Wheeler was 17 now, in his 5th summer with the Black Cowboys Association. He was riding his own horse, a 4-year-old bay gelding he had selected himself from the association's youth acquisition program, and that he had been training for 2 years with Ezekiel's supervision. He could rope. He could cut cattle in the learning sense of someone who has the correct instinct and is developing the correct technique. He had competed in 2 junior rodeos and had placed in both. He had not been in a grandstand that chanted his name. He would be someday. The foundation for that moment had been laid on a Saturday in August in a warm-up ring when a man on a black horse had come through the gate and said, "Mount up correctly, back straight, weight in the heels, eyes forward." Ezekiel Monroe was 63 years old. He was the president of the Black Cowboys Association of America and the owner of Monroe Ranch and the grandson of James Henry Monroe, who had bought 12 acres in Blackwood County in the early 20th century and who had grown it to 47, and who had told his grandson, "You go ride. You ride the way I showed you." He was going to be at the Blackwood County Rodeo and Stock Show next year. He was going to ride through the South Corridor on Midnight Justice. He was going to make it to the warm-up ring. His students were going to be there mounted and ready, back straight, weight in the heels, eyes forward. They were going to give the demonstration that the midday exhibition program had included for 10 years and 11 and 12, and however many years it took until the thing that the Black Cowboys Association was building was so permanently visible in the record of Blackwood County and the record of this rodeo and the record of American cowboy culture, that no one in any South Corridor at any rodeo would need to have 600 people explain it to them. The chant had done some of that explaining. The demonstration had done more. The combined effect was the kind of thing that stays in the record of a county and a rodeo and a community. Ezekiel Monroe knew this because he had been paying attention to records for 63 years, the records of his grandfather's land and his grandfather's horses and his grandfather's work, the records of 35 years of rodeo competition and 9 years of the association's program at this rodeo, the records that said we were here. We built this. We are still here. The footage went wide on the same afternoon. 9 separate cell phone videos had been uploaded to social media before the rodeo's afternoon session was over. The clearest of the 9 had been recorded by a woman in the 8th row of the South Grandstand, a retired school teacher named Beverly Nash, who had been filming the South Corridor because she had noticed Pruitt's approach before Marcus Tate had picked it up on the PA, and who had kept the camera steady and running for 4 minutes and 47 seconds through the credential demand, through the dismount demand, through the bridle, through the chant, through Webb's arrival, through the apology, through the nod, through the lope, through Marcus Tate's voice on the PA saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, that is Ezekiel Monroe and Midnight Justice." Beverly Nash had posted the video at 2:19 p.m. By midnight, it had 400,000 views. By the following morning, it had 2.3 million. By the end of the week, it had been shared in 47 states on 14 international platforms and referenced in a segment on a national news broadcast that began with the phrase, "You may have seen this footage." If you have not here, it is. The comments on the footage were by the standards of internet commentary coherent. They were coherent because the footage was coherent. What the footage showed was something that did not require explanation or framing to understand a man who knew what he was doing on a horse, that knew what it was doing, being told to stop doing it by someone who had not done the work required to know what he was seeing. And then 600 people explaining it, and then the man nodding and going. The comments that accumulated over the first 48 hours were in various forms versions of the same observation. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He sat there on that horse, and he waited, and when they cleared it up, he just went and rode. Some of those comments were from people who had never ridden a horse and had no particular relationship with rodeo culture. Some of them were from competitive riders, from ranchers, from rodeo professionals who understood the specific skill visible in the footage with a precision that non-riders did not have access to. Some of them were from black people who had spent their lives navigating the specific experience of being required to explain themselves in spaces they had more right to than the person requiring the explanation. Some of them were from people who had no particular connection to any of those categories and who had watched the footage and had seen what 600 people at a Texas rodeo in August saw, which is a man being wronged and then being corrected and going about his day. The national news segment had reached out to Ezekiel Monroe's office. He had provided a statement. The statement read, "The Black Cowboys Association of America has been participating in the Blackwood County Rodeo and Stock Show for 9 years. We have 43 member organizations in 16 states and more than 400 students in our youth program. We have a permanent partnership with the National Cowboy Museum. We have been doing this work for 12 years, and we intend to do it for 12 more. What happened on Saturday was incorrect. It has been corrected. We will be back." He had written the statement on the same yellow legal pad he used for program planning. He had read it back once, made one change he had originally written, "We will return," then changed it to, "We will be back because we will be back" was the correct phrasing for something that requires no further justification, and then he had faxed it from the office at Monroe Ranch. He had then driven a fence post that needed driving on the north perimeter of the property and had done 2 more things that needed doing because the next morning was going to start at 4:45, and there was no reason for it not to. The morning after the rodeo, he was up at 4:45. The alarm was the same alarm. The mug was the same mug. The path from the house to the barn was the path he had walked every morning for 31 years on this property since he had come back from Houston after finishing his degree, and had told his father, "I'm going to run the ranch." His father had said, "I know." His father had known since Ezekiel was 4 years old, sitting on a mare named Josephine with his grandfather's hands guiding him, and the guide had been not instruction so much as the physical communication of someone who has done a thing for 50 years transmitting something to someone who is going to do it for 50 more. He fed midnight justice at 5. He walked the property from 5:15 to 6, the way he walked it every morning, north fence, east fence, the creek line at the back of the property, the open pasture, the barn lot, checking the things that needed to be checked, making the notes that needed to be made. The ranch was 114 acres, and it had been in his family for 3 generations, and every acre of it was inside his body in the specific way that land gets into the body of a person who has walked it since before they could walk it independently. He had not thought about the previous afternoon. He had thought about the fence post he had driven yesterday, and whether the tension on the wire it anchored was correct. He had thought about one of the younger horses, a 3-year-old gelding named Earl, who was at a stage in his training where the next 3 weeks were going to determine a great deal, and who required Ezekiel's attention in the specific way that a training phase requiring precision requires full presence, not distraction. He had thought the fence post is correct. He had thought Earl needs 30 minutes this morning before anything else. He had not thought about Dale Pruitt. He had not thought about the grandstand. He had not thought about the 2.3 million views. This was not compartmentalization. It was not the performance of composure for an audience. It was the natural consequence of 63 years of building something that was larger than any single day's incident, and the understanding that a man who owns land and rides horses and runs an organization that serves 400 young people does not have the resource to let any single incident become the center of his attention when there is work to be done. There was always work to be done. Earl got his 30 minutes at 5:40. Ezekiel had a coffee on the porch at 6:30 and watched the light come up over the east pasture. The east pasture was 50 acres of Blackwood County, Texas, that James Henry Monroe had paid for with 35 years of work, that his son had paid for with 30 years of work, and that Ezekiel Monroe was paying for with his own 31 years on this property. The light came up over it the same way every morning. The grass was the grass his grandfather had planted in sections, improving the quality of the forage over time, with the specific patience of a man who understood that you plant for a future you may not entirely see. His grandfather had seen enough of it. James Henry Monroe had lived to 84. He had been there for the first 4 years of Ezekiel's rodeo career. He had been in the passenger seat for the drive to the 1987 national competition in Fort Worth, which had been Ezekiel's first national at 26 years old, and they had driven the 4 hours from Blackwood County to Fort Worth with the horse trailer behind them and his grandfather in the passenger seat telling stories about the horses he had known and the riders he had seen, and the one time in 1952 that he had ridden in an exhibition at a county fair 40 miles from where they were driving, and the exhibition had been the most people he had ever ridden in front of. And he had been 23 years old, and he had ridden the way his father had taught him, and at the end of it a man in the crowd had come over to him and said, "Where did you learn to ride like that?" James Henry Monroe had said at home. He had said it the way a man says something that requires no elaboration, and the man in the crowd had nodded, and that had been the end of it, and James Henry Monroe had loaded his horse into the trailer and driven home. Ezekiel had heard that story before the Fort Worth trip. He had heard it at least 3 times, maybe 4. He had not told his grandfather that he had heard it before. He had listened to it again on the drive to Fort Worth with the specific quality of attention that you give to a story told by an 82-year-old man on what turns out to be the last long drive you take together, even if you do not know at the time that it is the last one. He had placed 4th at Fort Worth. His grandfather had been in the stands. He had said after you rode. He had said it the way he said everything about riding, which was with the economy of language that belongs to a man for whom riding is so fundamental that it does not require much language to address in the same way that breathing does not require much language. Ezekiel Monroe had been placing for 35 years on the strength of what his grandfather had put in him. James Henry Monroe had been born in Blackwood County in 1919. He had grown up on 12 acres that his parents had purchased in 1904, which was the year that the county's land was available for purchase in the specific way that land becomes available when enough of the previous generation has passed or moved, and his parents had purchased it with money that had taken 8 years to accumulate, and they had put it in his grandfather's name because they understood the way title documentation worked in that county in 1904. And they knew whose name gave the title the most stability. The 12 acres had been his grandfather's life's work to protect and his father's life's work to add to. By the time James Henry Monroe was 40 years old, the land was 22 acres. By the time he was 60, it was 38. By the time he retired from the physical work of riding and fencing and the 1,000 other things a ranch requires, it was 47, and he had transferred it to his son, with a specific instruction you add to it. His son had added 67 acres. Ezekiel Monroe had not added any. He had held it. He had maintained it. He had improved it. The barn, the fencing, the forage quality in the east pasture, the water management system his father had started and that Ezekiel had finished with the specific engineering that water management on a property this size requires. He had not added acreage because the acreage that was there was already more than one man and one program could properly tend. And his grandfather had told him once, a man who owns more than he can tend is not a rancher. He is a landlord. His grandfather had said it with some feeling. His grandfather had been the son of a sharecropper, and he had some feeling about the distinction between owning and holding between property that produced work and property that produced rent. Ezekiel Monroe was a rancher. He was a rancher who had started the Black Cowboys Association of America 12 years ago on the specific recognition that the history his grandfather had given him was not widely known, not widely taught, and not widely visible in the public record of what American cowboy culture had produced, and that the public record was wrong, and that the correct way to address a wrong record was to make the correct record, which meant making it visible, which meant taking it into arenas and classrooms and exhibitions and rodeos and anywhere else that young people who needed to see it could find it. 462 youth program students over 12 years. 43 member organizations across 16 states. A permanent partnership with the National Cowboy Museum. 9 years of demonstrations at the Blackwood County Rodeo and Stock Show, starting with the 2-year negotiation with Thomas Avery, who had been skeptical and who had attended the first demonstration and who had said, after, "I'll see you next year." He had seen them every year since. The Monday after the rodeo, Avery had called Ezekiel at the ranch. He had said, "I want you to know that we are aware of what happened on Saturday. I want you to know that it does not reflect how this event regards the Black Cowboys Association. I want you to know that we are taking steps." Ezekiel had said, "I appreciate that." Avery had said, "I want to know if there is anything you need from us." Ezekiel had said, "What I need from you is to keep scheduling the demonstration. What I need is for my students to be in that arena next year. What I need is what we negotiated 9 years ago and what we have built since. That is what I need." Avery had said then, "That's what you've got." Ezekiel had said, "Good." He had said, "Thomas." Avery had said, "Yeah." Ezekiel had said the word was unfortunate. "I understand that the word was chosen carefully, but I want you to know that the correct word is incorrect. What happened was incorrect, and it has been corrected." Avery had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "You're right. I'll revise the statement." Ezekiel had said, "I appreciate it." He had hung up the phone and gone back out to the barn because Earl's afternoon session was at 2, and he liked to walk the horses through the east pasture on a lead line before a training session to settle them, and settling a 3-year-old who was at the stage Earl was at required the time it required. He walked Earl through the east pasture at 1:30. The east pasture was the same pasture his grandfather had planted. The grass came up through the specific rich soil that his grandfather had known was good soil that his grandfather had selected when he was walking the available land in 1924, looking for the right section to add to the 12, and the east 50 acres had been the right section, and his grandfather had planted grass in it in 1926, and the grass had produced forage for horses for exactly 100 years. 100 years of horses on that soil. Earl was easy on the lead. He was a good horse, not as good as Midnight Justice, because Midnight Justice was the horse that came once in a career. If you were fortunate, the horse that had the specific combination of intelligence and sensitivity and physical quality that makes a horse that every rider who sees him move understands is exceptional. But Earl was good. Earl had the intelligence. He had the sensitivity. He had the willingness. What he did not yet have was the experience, and experience was exactly what the next 3 weeks were going to give him, if the next 3 weeks were done correctly. Ezekiel Monroe was going to do them correctly. He had been doing things correctly for 63 years. The formal reprimand that Dale Pruitt received was a procedural document. It named the specific policy provisions he had violated the event security protocol requiring officers to remain within their assigned areas. The protocol requiring verification through a supervisor before initiating any action with a member of the public outside the officer's assigned area, and the specifically named policy prohibiting officers from making physical contact with any animal belonging to a licensed exhibitor without supervisory authorization. The reprimand noted that Pruitt had attended 0 of the 2 required briefings for Saturday's event and had been unaware of the designated exhibitor corridor, the credentialing system, or the Black Cowboys Association's status as a licensed exhibitor. The reprimand did not speculate about why Pruitt had not attended the briefings, or about what had produced the assumption that allowed him to approach a man in full Western gear on a horse moving through a designated exhibitor corridor and conclude that this man required credential verification from a security officer who had not attended the briefings that would have told him who this man was. The procedural language could not hold the entire story. Procedural language rarely can. Sergeant Karen Webb had submitted her own report to the investigation. She had submitted it in the first person in the specific careful prose of a person who understands that her report is a primary document and that primary documents are the ones that get read when something matters. She had described the morning briefing and what it had covered. She had described the credential verification system and how it worked. She had described the designated corridor and what it was designated for. She had described receiving the radio transmission moving from the north gate arriving at the south corridor at 90 seconds. She had described what she saw when she arrived. She had described Ezekiel Monroe on Midnight Justice, straight-backed, composed hands on the reins, the gray felt hat. She had described Pruitt with his hand on the bridle. She had described ordering Pruitt to step back. She had described Pruitt's initial resistance and her second order and his compliance. She had described looking at Ezekiel Monroe and apologizing. She had written Mr. Monroe accepted the apology with a single nod and proceeded to the warm-up ring. He conducted his exhibition without incident. The demonstration was excellent. The crowd responded appropriately. She had written in the final paragraph the incident was the result of an officer acting outside his assigned area without the contextual knowledge required to make a sound assessment. I want to note for the record that the contextual knowledge was available to him. It had been communicated at 2 separate briefings that he did not attend. The briefings are mandatory. I am requesting that the reprimand reflect the mandatory nature of the briefings that were not attended. The reprimand had reflected it. What the reprimand had not reflected, and what Sergeant Webb had not written because she was writing a procedural document, and procedural documents have limits, was the specific feeling she had carried from the South Corridor for the rest of that afternoon. She had managed events for 4 years. She had seen things go wrong at events in the way that things go wrong when you have a lot of people and a lot of moving parts and a lot of variables. She had seen officers make mistakes. She had not seen anything quite like the specific quality of Ezekiel Monroe on Midnight Justice in the South Corridor. She had not seen anything quite like the way he had been in the saddle during those minutes. Absolutely still, absolutely present the horse, calm beneath him, the officer's hand on the bridle, 600 people building toward a chant in the grandstand, and the man in the saddle giving none of it, anything other than the exact quality of patient presence he brought to everything. She had thought afterward, with the specific honesty of a person reviewing an event that did not go correctly, the bearing he carried in that moment was a form of dignity that I have not often seen. And the thing that Dale Pruitt missed looking at that man was that the dignity was not a performance. It was not composure adopted for the situation. It was the natural expression of 63 years of a life built in a specific way, and what Pruitt missed when he looked at Ezekiel Monroe was 63 years. She had thought that is what the assumption costs. Not just the man's time, not just the crowd's patience. It cost you 63 years. You miss everything that produced the person standing in front of you, and you respond to what you think you're seeing instead of what is actually there. She had written none of this in her report. She had written the incident was the result of an officer acting outside his assigned area without the contextual knowledge required to make a sound assessment. Both things were true. Jordan Wheeler was at the warm-up ring when Ezekiel came through the gate on Midnight Justice at 11:51. He had been there for 20 minutes. He had arrived early because Jordan Wheeler had been arriving early to anything connected to the Black Cowboys Association for 2.5 summers, and arriving early was one of the things Ezekiel Monroe had told him mattered. He had said everything you're going to do in your life, Jordan. Somebody is going to watch you do it. Somebody is always watching. The question is not whether they're watching. The question is what you're giving them to see. What you're giving them to see when you arrive early is, I take this seriously. What you're giving them to see when you arrive late is, I don't. You choose which of those things you want people to see, but you only get to choose it once per impression. Jordan had arrived early every time since. He had heard the chant from the warm-up ring. He was on Delta, the chestnut mare who was patient in the way of good lesson horses, responsive to correct signals, willing not easily disturbed by noise or crowd, which was a quality that had been developed in her through the specific training of a horse that participates in exhibitions where crowd response is unpredictable. Delta had not moved when the chant started. She had moved her ears. She had remained still otherwise. Jordan had heard the chant and had felt the mare under him, and had said quietly to no one in particular, "That's Mr. Monroe's name." They're saying his name. The other students had heard it too. There were 8 of them in the warm-up ring, 7 mounted and 1 walking a horse on a lead, because the horse had been a little nervous coming into the fairgrounds and needed more ground time before mounting. They ranged in age from 11 to 16. They had been training together for 6 weeks. 3 of them had ridden with the association the previous summer. 2 of them were first years in their initial summer program, learning the basics: how to sit, how to move with the horse, how to communicate what you want through seat and hand, and the subtle language of weight that a well-trained horse responds to before it responds to anything else. All 8 of them had heard the chant. None of them had moved. They had sat or stood with their horses in the warm-up ring, and they had listened to 600 people saying, "Let him ride, let him ride, let him ride." And they had not said anything to each other, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Because the chant was clear and the situation was clear, and the thing that needed to happen was for Mr. Monroe to come through the gate, and the thing that needed to happen after that was the exhibition. And the exhibition was the reason they had been riding for 6 weeks, and they were not going to do anything with the next 7 minutes except be ready. When Ezekiel came through the gate, Jordan said, "Mr. Monroe, we heard." Ezekiel said, "Mount up correctly, back straight, weight in the heels, eyes forward." Jordan said, "Yes, sir." He had ridden the exhibition that afternoon with the specific quality of a person who understands that something has happened that is larger than the individual day, and who understands that the correct response to something larger than the individual day is to do the individual day's work with the complete attention it requires, because the individual day's work is what the larger thing is made of. He had done his work. He was 17 now. He had been riding competitively for 2 years. He had placed at his first junior rodeo a third in the barrel racing, which was not his primary event, but which he had entered because Ezekiel had said, "You need to compete in events you don't win. You need to feel what it is to go in with less preparation than the other riders and still give the horse what it needs. You need to learn how to ride a difficult event with composure. The composure is more important than the event." He had placed third. He had ridden with composure. He had entered 4 more events since. He had placed in 3 of them. At his most recent, a regional junior rodeo in October of the previous year, he had placed second in the cutting event, which was his primary event and which required exactly the kind of specific animal reading intelligence that Ezekiel Monroe had spent 2.5 years developing in him through the particular teaching method of a man who does not teach by instruction so much as by example, and by the specific patient observation that allows a student to see what they are doing clearly enough to correct it themselves. Ezekiel had said after the October rodeo, "You rode that horse well." Jordan had said, "I had a good teacher." Ezekiel had said, "You did. But the teacher doesn't get in the saddle with you. What happens in the saddle is yours." Jordan Wheeler was going to compete at the regional level in 2 years. He was going to compete at the national level in 5. He did not know this. Ezekiel Monroe knew it the way that a man who has been watching riders for 35 years knows the ones who are going to get where they are going, which is the way that teachers know, which is not certainty but is something close to it when the evidence has been accumulating for long enough. He was going to ride through the South Corridor at the Blackwood County Rodeo on his own horse someday. He was going to ride through without incident because the incident in the summer of his second program year had produced a departmental briefing revision, an event security protocol update, a mandatory credentialing orientation for all officers assigned to rodeo events, and the specific institutional memory that accumulates around events that become footage that 2.3 million people watch. He was going to ride in because Monroe Ranch and the Black Cowboys Association had built the record that made it possible, and records once made do not easily unmake themselves. Ezekiel Monroe was going to be there to see it. He intended to be at the Blackwood County Rodeo for the next 20 years on some horse or another Midnight Justice. As long as Midnight Justice was going and whoever came after, because there was always a horse coming up on the ranch, and the coming-up horses were trained by the same hands and in the same tradition that James Henry Monroe had established when he bought 12 acres in Blackwood County and started teaching his son how to ride. The tradition had a specific quality that Ezekiel had tried over 12 years of building the association to articulate in language clear enough to pass on. He had not yet found language clear enough. What he had found were the riders, 462 of them. They ranged in age from 8 to 19. They came from Blackwood County and from 42 other counties and 42 other contexts and 42 other starting points, and what they had in common was that they had come to the Black Cowboys Association and had gotten on a horse and had at some point in their first summer felt what it was to communicate with an animal through the specific language of seat and hand and weight. And the animal had responded, and the response had produced in them the specific, irreversible understanding that a horse and rider who know each other can accomplish something that neither can accomplish alone. That understanding was what James Henry Monroe had given Ezekiel at 4 years old. That was what Ezekiel Monroe had been giving away for 12 years. It was not something that an officer with his hand on a bridle could take. It was not something that 600 people needed to explain. It was there before the grandstand turned, and it was there after the grandstand turned, and it was there when Ezekiel Monroe loped Midnight Justice through the South Corridor toward the warm-up ring, while the crowd was on its feet, and Marcus Tate had the microphone back, and the Texas August sun was on all of it. It was there in the way Midnight Justice moved. It was in the way Ezekiel sat in the saddleback straight weight, in the heels eyes forward, the instruction his grandfather had given him at 4 years old. The instruction he had given Jordan Wheeler at the end of the incident. The instruction that was inside the movement that a rider carries without knowing they are carrying it, the way all of what we were given by the people who came before us rides with us wherever we go, and does not require a grandstand to be visible, and does not require an incident to announce itself, and does not require anyone's permission to be what it has always been. He had gone. He had ridden. He had come back the next year. He had come back at 7 a.m. on the day of the following year's rodeo with the trailer and Midnight Justice and the students, 9 of them this year. One more than the previous year, because the footage had brought 3 new families to the association's enrollment information session in October, and one of those families had a 14-year-old daughter named Amara, who had been riding since she was 6. And who had shown up to the enrollment session in Blackwood County, having already competed in 2 junior events and was looking for the program that would take her where she was trying to go. Ezekiel had said at the enrollment session, "This is the right program." He had said it to all 3 families, and he had meant it for all 3. And he had meant it specifically for Amara, because he had watched her sit in the chair during the session with the specific quality of attentiveness that a rider has when they are hearing something they recognize. And recognition was the thing he was looking for in prospective students. Not talent, not experience, but the willingness to pay full attention to the thing in front of them. She had been at the summer program the following June. She had been in the demonstration at the following August rodeo. 9 riders this time on 9 horses in 2 columns of 4 and 5 coming through the arena gate behind Ezekiel Monroe on Midnight Justice, and the grandstand had been full for it, the way it had been full for the demonstration the previous year, and the fullness had a different quality than before. It had the quality of a crowd that has made a decision, that has decided this demonstration is worth arriving for, that has put it in the calendar, the way you put things in the calendar that you do not intend to miss. Marcus Tate had introduced it this year differently. He had said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Black Cowboys Association of America has been at this rodeo for 10 years. 10 years. In all the years I've been doing this, 9 years participating, and 1 year of negotiating with Thomas Avery to let them participate. And Thomas, you can tell me if I got that wrong. I can tell you that what you're about to see is the best midday exhibition this rodeo has ever had. 10 years. Ladies and gentlemen, Ezekiel Monroe and the Black Cowboys Association." The grandstand had responded before the gate had opened. Thomas Avery had been in the stands for it. He had told Ezekiel afterward, 10 years Zeke. He had said it the way that a person says a number that has surprised them by arriving. Ezekiel had said 11 next year. Avery had said 11 next year. He was going to keep coming back. Marcus Tate had given one interview to a rodeo industry publication 6 weeks after the first incident, and the interview had been reprinted in 3 other publications and cited in the national news coverage. The interviewer had asked, "When you saw what was happening in the South Corridor, what went through your mind?" Tate had said, "I had the microphone in my hand. I said what I saw." What I saw was Zeke Monroe on Midnight Justice being told he couldn't go through the South Corridor. I have been watching Zeke Monroe ride since before I was the announcer at this rodeo. I have been watching him bring students to this program for 9 years. I have watched him negotiate to be in this program when the program was not inclined to have him, and I have watched him build something here that is a part of what this rodeo is. And when I saw what was happening in the South Corridor, I said what I saw, and the grandstand said what it had to say. And then he went and rode. He always goes and rides. He had been quiet for a moment in the recording. He had said, "That's the thing you have to understand about Zeke Monroe. You can put an obstacle in the South Corridor. What happens is the obstacle eventually moves, and he rides." The record of the August rodeo now said 600 people in a Texas grandstand said let him ride. He had ridden. He had come back the next year. He would ride next year, and the year after, and the year after that. Marcus Tate had been right about the obstacle. James Henry Monroe had said it differently at the gate to the arena in Fort Worth in 1987, with his grandson in the driver's seat and the brakes that needed replacing and the horse that needed the farrier. This is what we came for. The afternoon of the first rodeo, after Ezekiel had come home and Midnight Justice was in the east pasture, and the trailer was parked and the calls had been made. Ezekiel Monroe had sat on the porch of the ranch house in the dark and had looked out at the land. The east pasture was out there in the night, and the horses in it were shapes he could not quite see, but knew the location of the way. You know, the location of something you have been looking at every day for 31 years. The ranch was quiet. The fairgrounds were 40 miles to the east. The video was already approaching 1 million views by the time he sat on the porch. He had not been thinking about the video. He had been thinking about Jordan Wheeler saying back straight, "Weight in the heels, eyes forward." He had been thinking that is the correct instruction. He gives it back correctly. He understands why it is the first thing and the last thing. He is going to be a rider. He had sat on the porch in the dark and thought about his grandfather sitting in the passenger seat of the truck on the way to Fort Worth and telling the story about the 1952 exhibition and the man who had asked where he learned to ride and the answer that had required only 2 words. At home, this was home. 114 acres, 3 generations, 100 years of horses on this soil. 462 students who had learned what it meant to be on a horse when the horse and the rider were both paying attention to each other and both doing what the relationship required. The east pasture in the dark. The August night of Blackwood County, Texas. He had sat on the porch until 9:30. Then he had gone inside and gone to sleep because 4:45 came early and Earl needed 30 minutes in the morning before anything else, and there was always work to be done on Monroe Ranch, which was the specific quality of a place that is alive and intended to stay that way. "You go ride," his grandfather had said. He had gone. He was still going. The South Corridor was 40 miles to the east. Monroe Ranch was here. The horses were in the pasture his grandfather had planted. The students were going to be at the barn in June. The tradition was intact and the record was visible, and the demonstration had been excellent. And that was the story of the day in its full and complete version. A man got on his horse and rode.